So now that we got some basics about Vue.js out of the way, it's time to practice it. Attached you find this starting project. It's, again, 3 files, some styles which you don't have to worry about right now, an index.html file with some instructions, to which I'll come back in a second, and an empty app.js file, which is, of course, the place where you should write your code later. Now in index.html, you see the instructions. On the right side, you see the running application, if you want to call it like this, but of course a lot of logic is missing there. Your first task is to output your name here. The second task is to output your age here. And of course, you should not just add your name here like this. Instead, you should use Vue.js and maybe some cool syntax you learned about to store your name in the Vue instance and output it with some Vue syntax here. And the same for the age. The same here for the age, +5. And thereafter, it's time to output a random number. Now, we haven't done this before, but you can use a regular JavaScript method for generating a random number between 0 and 1. And I want you to output this random number here in this place. As a little extra challenge, try to output it here in 2 different ways. One time using a method which you call, and the other time not doing so. If you're not sure what I mean, you can just watch my solution, of course, then. But again, if you have some idea, try it in 2 different ways. Otherwise, at least use one way of outputting a random number here. Task number 5 is that you should output an image here. And I want you to simply go to Google or any similar provider and search for some random free-to-use image URL and output the image here, but of course, again, not by just throwing in some image URL here. Instead, again, you should store that URL in the Vue instance and then make sure you fetch it from there and output it with some Vue syntax. And the same here for this input. I want you to pre-populate the input field by setting the value attribute. And again, of course, by doing that with some Vue features to set it to a value you will store in your Vue instance. Now, that's it. These are your tasks. You will need to create a Vue instance, and you will need to use the various syntax features you learned about over the last lectures. After this video, you'll find my solution video, which you absolutely should check out to see how I solved this, but definitely try it on your own first. So, let's solve these tasks here. The goal is to control this section with Vue, so within Vue app with a Vue instance, and then store some data in that Vue app, which we can output here, our name, here, our age, and then also here in those other places where we output some, at least a little bit more dynamic data, like our age +5 years. That is the goal. Now, with that, let's get started. I already do have the Vue import here, and I import the app.js file. So in the app.js file, since we do import Vue globally, we can use that globally available Vue object and call create app on it, just as you learned it over the last lectures. This creates a Vue app. You could also say a Vue instance, and I will use these terms interchangeably. We can store this app in a variable or constant, and this app needs some configuration. It needs an object, which we pass to create app, where we configure this Vue instance. Now in there, you learned we can add data and methods. We can also add more, which we'll learn throughout the course. And we're going to start with some data, which, and this is really important, has to be a method. So a data property that holds a function. And this is just the shorthand form of writing this. And this data method should return the actual data object full of all the data this Vue app is aware of. In this case, since we plan on outputting a name and an age, I think it makes sense to store a name field in here, which in my case is Maximilian, and an age field, which in my case holds a value of 31. But of course, you can name these properties in this returned object however you want, because as I mentioned, whilst the property names in the object you pass to create app are not up to you, you have to use data and methods and so on here, because Vue will look for those keys. This object here, which you return in data, is a different thing. This really is your data, the data you want to have in this Vue app, and therefore you can have any key value pairs in there. In my case, name and age. And now we want to output that information in this section. But for that, one important step is missing. We need to control this section with our Vue app. Thus far, I'm creating the app, but I'm not connecting it to the section here. For that, we need to call the mount method on our app. And to mount, we pass a string with a CSS selector that uniquely selects the part of the HTML code we want to control. And therefore, typically, we use an ID. We give this section an ID, which we could name assignment, but the ID name is totally up to you. And then down there, we can use an ID selector with hashtag assignment. Now, as a little side note, you could use other CSS selectors, like class selectors as well, but this would always just select the first occurrence of this class, because every app can only be connected to one HTML element. That's why you typically use an ID, since IDs should be unique in HTML, and that makes total sense if you then, well, just want to control one element with that ID. So now our Vue app here, this app, is connected with the mount method to this section with this ID. Now inside of this section, we can use this special Vue syntax. For example, the interpolation syntax here. So here where we want to output our name, we can use double curly braces opening and closing. And between those curly braces, we can point at our data properties. So add properties of this object which we return in data. So in this case, for example, name. And here we can point at age. And just name it age. Not this age or this name, not data.age or anything like that, just name and age. And Vue will automatically look in this object you return in data. Now these were the first two tasks already. We're outputting the name and the age. The next task is to output our age plus 5 here. And for that, we got various options. Here's option number 1. Again, we need the double curly brace syntax. There aren't many alternatives to that. You could use VHTML, but we don't want to output raw HTML here, so double curly braces makes a lot of sense. But we have different approaches regarding how we calculate our age plus 5. We can simply do age plus 5 here. This will work because, as you learned, between those curly braces, but also when using vbind, you can execute simple JavaScript expressions like this one. So if I save that and reload, here we see the age plus 5, which in my case is 36. But there also is an alternative to that. We could also specify a method. And for that, we add this methods key to this config object we're passing to create app. So next to data, we have methods. And methods holds an object full of the methods, so full of the functions we want to call from inside our Vue app. And there we could add a calculateAge method if we wanted to, and return this.age plus 5. Now here it's this.age to access this age, because as I also explained, Vue takes all the properties you have in this object here, which you return in data, and merges it behind the scenes into this Vue app object which it creates. It also merges all the methods into that object, by the way. And therefore, this in here refers to this magically created and managed object behind the scenes, and has therefore access to all those merged properties like age. That's why this age will give us access to this age. And now that we have this method, instead of running this code here in the template, which we could do, but instead of doing that, we can also just run calculate age here, like this. And if I saved it and reload, we get the same result, it's just a different approach. Now, which approach is better? Wait a bit, I'll come back to that in later lectures when we also learn about another alternative. Now, the next task is to output a random number here. And again, we basically have the same two options. We need double curly braces because we want to output something which is dynamically derived with help of view. But now we could do math random in here, save that and reload, and we would see a different random number every time we reload. But we can also, again, use a method to move that code out of our HTML code into our JavaScript code. We could name it calculate random, but the name is totally up to you. You can use any name you want. And then here return math random. And then here, instead of calling math.random, we could calculate random, save that, reload, and we also again get different random numbers. Now that was task number 4. Now in task number 5, it gets a bit more tricky. Now we want to search some image on Google image search, and output it here. And of course not by simply putting the URL in here, which we absolutely could, but instead by leveraging our view knowledge and by storing the image link here in our view data and then binding this source dynamically to our data. Now for that, I picked some random image and I'm going to store it in a new property in this data object, image URL. Again, this name is totally up to you. Now in there, I just stored the link in a string, and now I want to use that image URL property here to set the source of this image. Now you learned that you can't use double curly braces here. This will not work. If we try to do that, we'll not see anything. Instead, when you want to set the value of an attribute to a dynamic value, so to a view managed value, you need this special directive, this instruction view provides to you, the vbind directive. Then you need a colon, and after that the attribute which should be configured with vbind, so which should be set with vbind. And then here you don't need the curly braces, but you simply now have the data property name or the method name you want to point at here. And if I now save that and reload, here's my image. Now, you'll see the styling is a bit off. Looks like I forgot to give this some sizing before I picked it, but that does not matter too much. What matters here is that we see an image. We'll build more realistic and beautiful apps throughout the course, no worries. Now, last but not least, we got an input field. And now the goal is not to listen to what the user enters. We're going to do that soon. But the goal is to pre-populate this input field with our name, with help of the value attribute. Now again, we can do this without view, of course. If I do this here and reload, I see my name down there. But the goal is not to do it like this, but to do it with view, so that later we can also leverage view in other ways and make this more dynamic. And we actually do have our name stored in a data property already. So therefore, again, we want to bind this value attribute to a value stored in our view app. And we can do this with, well, vbind. Vbind value with this syntax and now bind it to name, because name is the, well, name, the property name we're using for this property which holds my name. And now if I save that and reload, my name, which I do have managed in view, is output as a default here in this input field. And that is it for the moment. Now, of course, we still got missing features. For example, we can't really react to user input and anything like that. But that's something we'll focus on next. So now we know how to output data. In modern web applications, that's only half of what you do though. You also need to react to user input. You need to react to events. You want to make dynamic pages. After all, this is one of the main reasons for using a framework like Vue. It makes building highly reactive and dynamic web applications easier. Therefore, that's what we're going to focus on next, and attached you find a simple starting project which is not too different from the one before. We just have a slightly different content. Still got a section with a different ID now, and in there we got two buttons, add and remove. We also have a paragraph where I output a counter which is managed in this View app which is created for you already. It's a very simple View app here, as you can tell. Pretty empty, just has this data method where I return my data, which only consists of a counter in the end, which is a number starting at 0, and I mount this to the events section, which is this section that holds all that markup. Now at the moment those buttons don't do anything. If I press them, you'll see that, well, nothing happens. And that's exactly what we want to work on. I want to show you how you can react to user input and how you now can really leverage Vue to make a more interactive and reactive web application. Let's say when this button, the add button, when this button is pressed, we want to add 1 to the counter. When the remove button, or reduce maybe, when the reduce button is pressed, we want to deduct 1 from the counter. Let's start with the add button. How could we do that? In regular JavaScript, we would get access to the button with document get element by ID if that button had an ID, or with query selector and selecting the first button we find. And we could add an event listener with the add event listener method. That is how we would do it in vanilla JavaScript without Vue. But we're using Vue so that we don't have to do it like this, so that we don't have to define step by step what should happen, but that we instead can leverage this declarative approach and just declare our end result and let Vue figure out how to get there. And therefore, thankfully, Vue gives us an easier way of adding event listeners to HTML elements. If we want to add a click listener to this button, we can use another Vue directive. We learned about vbind. Vbind is helpful for setting the value of an attribute. Now for adding event listeners, we have another directive, and that's the von directive, because we want to react on a certain event. von takes a so-called argument after a colon, just like vbind took the attribute which should be bound. von takes the event to which you want to listen after the colon. In this case, click. Now, in case you're wondering to which events you can listen, well, all the default events you can listen to on HTML elements. So that would be click, mouse enter, mouse leave, really anything you can listen to in vanilla JavaScript as well. Here, it's the click to which I want to listen. And then after an equal sign between the opening and closing double quotes, we now specify the code that should run when the click occurs. And that could be counter ++, which is the shortest form of writing in JavaScript that we want to add 1 to the counter. And that's just JavaScript code, nothing Vue specific. As with vbind and the double curly braces, you can have simple JavaScript expressions right here in your HTML code in the parts that are managed by Vue, like here with von. If I now save that and reload, I can click add, and you will see that the counter gets bigger every time I click this button, thanks to this code. Now try doing, well, basically the same, just with reducing the counter on this button. Were you successful? Well, of course, it shouldn't be too difficult. It's essentially the same code. We want to react to a click event with von click, and then here we just have counter minus minus, or the longer form would also work, of course. It's totally up to you what you write there. With that, you can also reduce the counter. So now we can add and reduce. And that's pretty nice. And this is how we can listen to user events in Vue. And here's one super important thing which is easy to overlook, which shows us why we use Vue and how powerful Vue is. You might notice that we don't have much code here. Some HTML code, and definitely not a lot of JavaScript code. I mean, this here is all the JavaScript code we wrote. Yet we have 2 event listeners and a counter that changes, and most importantly, and easy to overlook. We got a counter that's being output here, where the page the user sees changes every time the counter changes. This -6 here changes to a -5 if I click the button. And that's not something which would normally happen in a web page. You would need to write JavaScript code that adds event listeners, changes the counter, and then when the counter changes, reaches out to that paragraph to change the value that's showing up there. And that's exactly what Vue does behind the scenes for you. That is the core asset of frameworks like Vue. You just declare where you want to have event listeners and where you want to output values and which values Vue should be aware of. And Vue does all the rest of adding and managing those listeners, updating the counter behind the scenes, and most importantly, detecting when the counter changes and updating the parts of the real rendered page where updating is needed when that counter changes. This is what Vue does behind the scenes. This is a core feature of Vue, this built-in reactivity. It detects that the counter changes when you click a button, and it then finds the places on the page where the counter is used to update what the user sees with JavaScript behind the scenes. I'm really emphasizing this because it's so important to understand what Vue does here and hopefully why that's pretty amazing and makes our life as a developer much, much easier. Well, and that's how we can get started with events in Vue. Now let's see what else we can do with them. Now we learned how to listen to events. Now here's one important thing. Currently, I'm updating the counter here in my HTML code. In the Vue controlled parts, but in the HTML code. And it generally is considered a bad or not optimal practice to do that. You don't want to put too much logic into your HTML code. Instead, the HTML code should really just be about outputting stuff. Logic like this, even though it's not too complex, should typically go into your JavaScript code. Now, how could we get this logic into our JavaScript code? Well, we want to do something on every click. What do you typically use if you want to do something at a certain point of time, potentially in a repeated way? Well, you need a function that can be called. You need a function which you can call when the add button is clicked, and you need a function which you can call when the reduce button is clicked. Now, of course, we could specify a function here, add, and there try to set counter equal to counter plus 1. But for multiple reasons, this wouldn't work. For one, counter is not a globally available variable. It is a data property. Hence, it's not available here. In addition, even if it would be available for whatever reason, add now is a globally created function, but in your Vue-controlled HTML code, you can't use such a function. You can only use in this Vue-controlled HTML part what is defined in your Vue app. And that's why we use methods for that. And we did already learn about methods before. Now, we don't just use methods to manually call them as we did before. We can also use methods to connect them to event listeners and let Vue call them for us when a certain event occurs. For example, here we can add an add method, though this name here is totally up to you. You could also name it add counter or increment or whatever you want, but I'll name it add. And in here, you can now update this counter. Just important, as you learned, with this counter. In your JavaScript code, you refer to your data properties with this. This counter plus plus, or the longer form this counter equals this counter plus 1. It's the same. And with that, we have a method which we can call to update our counter. Now, this method doesn't return anything because it doesn't have to. We'll not use the method like we did before to dynamically output something here. Instead, we're using it to run it when a click occurs. And therefore, this doesn't need to return anything because the click listener doesn't want a return value. So now here, we can call add like this, And if I now save that and reload, I can click add and it still works because we're executing the same code just in a different way. And this is actually the better way of doing it. Putting your logic into JavaScript and just pointing at that logic, that is generally considered better, even though technically it here works in the same way. But consider cases where you have more complex logic, and it quickly makes sense that you should put that logic into JavaScript and not into HTML, so it's not bad to get started with that as a habit right from the start. Now, besides calling add like this, by the way, you can also just point at it, so that you tell Vue, hey, that's the name of the function, or of the method to be precise, you should execute when a click occurs. Vue accepts both. You explicitly calling it like this, or you pointing at it. Vue detects what you're doing and it will do the right thing in both cases. Now, typically you just want to point at it, since that is closer to vanilla JavaScript and how you would set up an event listener there, but it is worth noting that both syntaxes are allowed, as you can see here. Well, and now let's do the same for reducing our counter. Of course, try this on your own. Here's a quick pause for you to do that, and thereafter we'll do it together. Were you successful? Well, again, it's pretty much the same code. We can add a reduce method. Again, this name is up to you. And in there, we just set this counter equal to this counter -1, or we use the shorter form, which looks like this, which is also okay. And now in here on this second button, we can call reduce like this, or as I just mentioned, just point at it. Both is accepted. And now we got our working buttons with one important change. Now the logic is outsourced into JavaScript, which is where your logic should be, and the HTML code is leaner. And this is better. This is considered to be better, so it is a good idea to get started with this approach and with this pattern. Now, that is how we can use methods. We cannot just use them in curly braces or with vbind to dynamically derive a value we want to output, but we can also use them with event listeners to define code that should be executed when the event occurs. And in reality, you will more often use methods to connect them to events than you will use them to output something dynamically derived. I just showed this before to show you that it's possible and to introduce methods, but typically you'll use them like this in combination with event listeners. Okay, so we learned quite a bit about events. What if we now don't just want to add 1 and subtract 1, but we want to be able to add 5 and reduce this by 5? Maybe name it subtract therefore, whatever you want. But the goal is that we now don't just add and deduct 1, but instead 5. How would we do that? Well, we of course could accept a parameter in those methods, right? That is how we would probably do it in JavaScript. We can accept the parameter, number or num or n, totally up to you. It's your method, so you can accept whatever you want. And then we could add num here or reduce num. Of course, we could also make this less dynamic and just hardcode 5 here. The problem just is that whenever we plan to change this number, we need to change it down there in code. So it typically would be better to have a more dynamic method which gets the number which we want to add or remove and then uses this as a parameter like this. Then these methods will never need to be changed when we decide to deduct or add a different number. So that's the more generic and therefore typically better way of writing these methods. But how do we tell Vue that it should call add and reduce with a value of 5 for these parameters? Well, keep in mind, we can execute add like this by pointing at it or by calling it explicitly. Well, and if we call it like this, we're, as a developer, in full control over the value we want to pass to the parameters of these methods. So here we can add 5, for example, and reduce by 5, just like that. And now whenever we decide to go for a new value, we just have to change it here in HTML, where we're changing the caption of the button anyways, and the method will work correctly automatically because it's written in a very generic way. So if we now save that and reload, I can add 10 and subtract 5, and it just works. So passing arguments to methods is also possible, and it's very easy to do. And this is an important pattern to know. This is important to understand because in reality, in apps you're building with Vue, you will sometimes have the scenario that your method needs to get some parameter which you as a developer want to set. And as you see, setting it and telling Vue to call this method with this value is super, super easy. So this is taking shape. Let's now enhance this mini dummy app here a little bit. And let's add an input of type text here, just like this. And below that a paragraph where I say your name. And in here I want to output the username, but now the user should be able to enter the name in this input here. And that's the new thing. So we can have a name field here in our data. Initially it could be empty or your name, whatever you want. And we can output the name here with the double curly braces. But now I also have this input here, and whenever I type in here, I want to update the name which is output in this paragraph. Now how could we do that? Well, now that we learned about listening to events, we should have all the tools we need for that. We can add an event listener with vOn. And now, of course, I don't want to listen to the click event, but to every keystroke. We could do this with key up or key down, which all have their special behaviors. The best event to listen to on an input HTML element is the input event, which is a default DOM event available on input elements. Nothing Vue specific, you can listen to the input event in vanilla JavaScript as well. Here with vOn, I'm telling Vue that I want to listen to this input event on this input element. And therefore now, again, we can specify the code between these double quotes that should execute when an input event is emitted, which will be the case on every keystroke. That is how the input event is emitted by default. So now again, we could put the code in here or use this better approach of using a method. So I'll do that. Add a little method here, set name could be the method name because that's what we're going to do. Again, the name is up to you, but of course you want to name the method such that it describes what it's going to do. So here I'll use set name. And then I want to set this name, so this name property, which we added to our data object, equal to what the user entered. And that's going to be a bit tricky, won't it? Because how do we know what the user entered? We know that the user entered something because we're listening to that event, but how do we get the concrete value the user entered? Well, there is a built-in behavior built into JavaScript, not into Vue, which we can leverage. First of all, we can point at the setName method here, which is the method we want to execute on every keystroke. And now there's a cool behavior in JavaScript, not in Vue. Vue just also is able to use it. When you add an event listener and you then point at a function that should be executed when that event occurs, that function will automatically get one argument. The browser will ensure that this argument is provided, so to say. And that will be an object describing the event that occurred. So here in setName, we can accept this one argument, this one parameter. You can name it however you want, but you will always get this by the browser. We would have gotten this here for add and reduce as well. We just overrode it with our own custom argument we're passing in. But since I'm not executing setName with parentheses here, but I'm pointing at it, I don't override it, and I let the browser provide this default event object. And why is this useful? because this default event object will be full of information about the event. And for example, it will give us information about the HTML element on which this event occurred, which is the input element, and we can then read the current value stored in this input from that input element. And we get access to the target of the event with event.target, and that's vanilla JavaScript. This is nothing Vue specific. This would work in vanilla JavaScript as well. This gives us access to the element on which the event occurred, and this is the input element in this case, which will have a value property. Again, that's just vanilla JavaScript. And you can search for MDN input to find more documentation on this input element. And in here, you will eventually somewhere find that this has a value property which you can use to read what the user entered. So this will be the value the user entered. Set name will be called on every input event, so on every keystroke. And this should update the name, our data property here, with every keystroke with the value the user currently entered here. And then we're outputting name down there. And if we now save that and reload, I can enter Maximilian and you see how this updates in the paragraph below. And that's Vue's reactivity in action again. It allows us to listen to this event and execute this code, and it then also detects that name changed and updates it in the places on the page where updating is needed. And as a side note, if I inspect this here in the Chrome DevTools, there is something other interesting which we can notice. If you watch this part on the right here, this HTML code, you'll see that the parts that are re-rendered by the browser flash. You see the paragraph with my name flashes. Now you will also see that nothing else on the screen flashed. For example, the counter didn't flash. This counter only flashes if I change the counter. Now these are the parts which are actually re-rendered on the screen. And you see that only the parts that really changed in code are re-rendered on the screen. And that's important. If Vue would update the entire screen whenever something changed somewhere, this would be bad for performance. Instead, Vue is really smart and it sees that with every keystroke here, only the name changes, and hence it only finds the places where I use the name, in this case this paragraph, and updates that. And the rest is, well, left untouched, and hence we save performance or have a better performance. Now, this is how we can work with events. There's just one more note about this default event object. You could have a scenario that you need to call your method explicitly on your own here, as we did it with add and reduce. For example, because you need to pass in some other argument, like a second name, which I always want to use here. We could accept this here, second name or last name, and then update name with whatever the user entered plus last name. Maybe also add a white space in front of it. The problem with that is that we now no longer get this default event object as a first argument here. Now, to still pass that in, there is a special variable which you can use here in your template, and that's $event. This is a reserved name, and Vue gives this variable to you to give you access to this built-in default event object, which you get automatically by the browser, so that you can use it here in this code as well, and for example, still pass it in as a first argument to setName if you wanted to. So whenever you find yourself using an argument here, or you simply can't just point at a function for whatever reason, and you need that built-in event, you can access it with $event. But again, this is only needed if you're not just pointing at the method as we did it before. Hence now if I reload, this still all works as before, but now with help of $event. That's just another side note because sometimes this is exactly what you need to get access to both the built-in event object you get automatically and still execute code on your own explicitly, for example, to pass in your own arguments. Now that we got the basics about events down, let's talk about event modifiers, which is another useful feature built into Vue. Here's an example for an event modifier that can sometimes be useful. Let's say you had a form HTML element. In there you had some input and you had a button that says sign up, whatever. If you reload, you have that here. Now the problem you'll have by default, if you leave it like that, even if it's in the view controlled HTML part, is that when you click this button, this page will reload. And the reason for that is that the browser default for a form with a button like this is to submit that form and send a HTTP request to the server serving this app. In this case, we have no such server. We're running this locally, but still, the browser simply sends a request to our local machine, therefore, you could say. Now, of course, we have no code in place to handle this request. Now, we'll get there later in this course, but typically with frameworks like Vue, you want to prevent this browser default, and instead you want to handle this manually in JavaScript with help of Vue in your Vue app. And you want to read the user input there, validate it, and then send it manually to a backend server and store it in a database, for example. So you want to prevent that browser default of automatically sending it. Now there are two ways of doing that. One of them is cool, and the other one is, well, more obvious, I would say. You can listen to the submit event here, which again is a default browser event to which you can listen on form elements. Then we could have a method here, submit form, like this, at which we can point here, submit form. Now we're telling Vue that whenever the form is submitted, submit form should be executed. And here we could do whatever we want, for example, show an alert, submitted. Now, right now, the problem is that we still have the browser default. If I click this, I get the alert, but the page reloads thereafter. And when the page reloads, that means we'll lose all our data, right? If I had a counter here and I click sign up, you'll see that all the data is lost because of the page reload. The Vue app restarts, so to say. So we haven't solved the problem. But remember that we get this default event object. I talked about that in the last lecture. Now we can call prevent default on that. This is a default browser mechanism. It's built in JavaScript, which is totally independent from Vue. Even if we just used vanilla JavaScript on that default event object which we get, we could call prevent default. And this would tell the browser that the form should not be submitted, that we don't want that browser default. So now if I reload, I can change my counter, click sign up, we see the alert, and the counter still is there because now that browser default has been prevented. This works, and there's nothing wrong with it, but Vue has a nicer way for us. We can remove all that code and instead use a so-called event modifier. There are certain built-in modifiers which you can connect to events you're listening to, let's say, to change that event behavior. And you add such a modifier with a dot after the event name after vOn. So vOn colon, then the event name, and then a dot if you want a modifier. Now, there are only a couple of supported modifiers. You can find a full list in the official docs. For example, there is a prevent modifier. And this modifier, which is built into Vue, will prevent the browser default. So it will basically do what we did manually a second ago, just with less code. There also is a stop modifier for stopping propagation, but here we need the prevent modifier. And with that, if we reload, I can click sign up, we see that alert, and still the page doesn't reload thanks to this modifier. So that's nice to know, and that will come in handy later. We don't just have such event modifiers to change the event and browser behavior, we also have modifiers we can connect to events to change when the event occurs. And one example would be our buttons. Let's say for whatever reason, we only want to subtract 5 if the user right-clicks on the button. The default, of course, is to react to a left click. But if we wanted to react to a right click, we could add a modifier here as well. And we can set it to right. Alternative values are left, which you don't need to specify because it's the default, middle, and, well, right. And this tells Vue that here, you only want to react to a right click. So when you're using a mouse event like click, you can use the right, left, and middle event modifiers to change which mouse button triggers this event. So if we now save this, you see I can add 10 by clicking with the left key. But if I click on subtract 5 with the left key, nothing happens. If I use the right mouse button though, which you can tell I'm doing because my context menu opens up, now the counter gets smaller. Of course, we can argue whether that's useful here, but it's definitely useful to be aware of those modifiers. And there's a last kind of modifiers, and that would be key modifiers when you're listening to keyboard events, like here on the input element. Currently, we're updating the name upon the input event here, so on every keystroke. Now let's say we want to update the internally stored name, so this name property, with every keystroke. But the name that's being output here should only be updated when the user hits enter on this input element. Well, for that, we could have another data property, confirmed name, which is the actual name we want to output here. So here we got the confirmed name in this paragraph. And the confirmed name, unlike the internally stored name, which is just named name, the confirmed name should only update here when the user hits the enter button in this input field. For that, we can add another event listener on the input element. Yes, you can have more than one. So here we're listening to input with v-on input. Now I'll add another v-on directive and also listen to the key up event, which is triggered when a key is pressed and released again. And here, I want to trigger a method which I have yet to add, which I'll call confirm input or confirm name, whatever you want. The goal here in confirm input is to set this confirmed name, so this new data property we added, which we're outputting in this paragraph, set this confirmed name equal to the internally stored name, which we update with every keystroke. So here, v-on key up, I want to point at confirm input. Now currently, this would fire whenever any key is pressed and released. So currently, if I reload here, we would basically have the same behavior as before. With every keystroke, the input event, but then also the key up event is triggered, and therefore we basically confirm the input with every keystroke. So that's probably not the final behavior we want. Instead, we can use another modifier with a dot here to tell Vue that since this is a keyboard event, we only want to trigger this event upon certain special keys that are pressed and released. For example, the enter key. You could also listen to control or shift or page down. All keyboard keys are possible here, but I want to listen to the enter key. And with that, I'm saying, hey, when the enter key is pressed and released, then confirm input should be executed. So now if I save that and reload, I can enter Maximilian here, and we see nothing in that green box. But if I place my cursor in here and hit enter, now we see that output here. So these are event modifiers. Now I'm quickly going to auto-format this HTML code with the format document key combination here in Visual Studio Code to make this more readable. but it's the same code as before, just structured differently. So that's the input we just worked on. We have the input event and the key up event with the enter modifier to change when confirm input executes. Now, to conclude this introduction to events, which is another core feature, as you can clearly tell, let me show you one other directive which you will very rarely need, but which sometimes in niche scenarios could be helpful. Let's say, for whatever reason, here in this app, we want to make sure that when we change the counter here, the output here doesn't change, so that the initial value of the counter is preserved here. Now you might wonder why we might want to do that. Let's say we have another paragraph where we simply output the starting counter value, and we want to point at the counter property we're managing in our view instance, so that if we ever change it here, we do reflect that correct starting counter here. But we want to make sure that the starting counter never changes. And right now, of course, since we reference counter, it will change whenever we change the counter. If you have such a scenario that you have some data that changes and you want to preserve the initial state and not reflect any other changes, there is a special directive you can put onto the element where you are using that dynamic value in. And that's the v_once directive, which is built into Vue. This tells Vue that any dynamic data bindings, like this interpolation here, on this element should only be evaluated once. So if that value changes thereafter, here in this place, it'll not be reflected, it'll not be updated. So now if I reload, we see the starting counter 10 here, but if I change the counter, it only changes down there in the second green box and not in the first one. Now again, this is a niche feature, but it is useful to be aware of it if you ever had a scenario like this where you need to lock an initial value in. v_once can help you with that.